if you grew up like I did, you heard in church a lot about the importance of being saved. In Introduction to Christian Theology, chapter 12, ICT 12 this week, the chapter is about the dimensions of salvation, and the ICT takes a more classical kind of approach to theology, and so it gets listed out in more of a classical way, soteriology and sanctification in more the classical terms. But the chapter is great because it kind of seeks to broaden or expand our notions of what that is. That's really it's the impact of good exegesis on our theology, because if you read the New Testament and you see the way the word soter, saved, liberated, rescued, gets used, you're going to see a lot. And what you're going to see is it's not all it's not just one type of thing. Like so for example, what is it? Mark 5, I think, is the Gerasene demoniac. Interesting story. Jesus goes into the Decapolis. That's the 10 cities. It's Greek. Greco-Roman area, not so the person he's dealing with is probably not Jewish, and he goes and he sees this guy, he's naked. You remember the story? He's naked. He's like broken his chains. He's crazed, and he's legion, this demonic power has ruined his life, and everything. He lives amongst the graves, and so if you're following, you're kind of thinking in terms of sort of Jewish expectations of holiness and whatnot. It's a terrifying scene because ritual impurity. You're given ritual impurity if you spend time with corpses. This guy lives amongst the dead. You should be clothed, and that's just proper way of being a part of a community. This guy's naked. He's alone. He is hurting himself in just about every way. That this scene looks like somebody who is just utterly cut off from community, right? And it's so fascinating. After Jesus expels the demon, we get this snapshot where it kind of flashes back, and there's the demoniac. He's clothed, and he's sitting with Jesus, and he's in his right mind talking. And there's this moment where he's like, "I want to follow you, Jesus." And what does Jesus do? He says, "No, go home." And so you can see that kind of what Jesus has done in this situation is not just an exorcism, although that too, and that's really an important constituent part of it. But what really, at the end of the day, what he's done is he's taken this guy who was completely cut off from society, from his tribe, his people. He was socially isolated, and he's reinserted him. He's like, "Go home. Now you're okay. Now you can be back with your people. Now you can be embedded again in a community." The salvation, as it were, is not just some kind of liberation from demonic bondage. The salvation is this guy's part of a community again. And it's so interesting. You look at the New Testament after that in the early church and the way Paul talks about it, James and Peter. The church is supposed to be this place where you fit, you belong. The church is a salvation for those who have been cast off, who have been ignored and excluded. The church is home for them. God's created a place where you can be saved from the terrible ill that is social isolation. The Old Testament kind of assumes that to be truly human, you have to be embedded in a community, and Jesus saves. Jesus puts you into that community. And so if our churches aren't providing that, well, that's a problem with our church. Practical theology problem. If your church is not creating a community that welcomes and inserts and embeds people, you're not participating in that dimension of salvation. Other ways. So, for example, when Jesus heals lepers, there's a number of times where that happens in the New Testament. Healing leprosy isn't that big a deal. Remember, leprosy is not typically what we think of as Hansen's disease, like your hands falling off because of decayed organs. That's not the way that the Bible thinks about leprosy. Leprosy in the Bible is just, especially in the Old Testament, it's just being ritually impure. Like you've got spots on your skin, or there's like you have a rash or something like that. It's hard to know exactly what's going on in the Old Testament law, but even the white stuff on my beard, it comes from a lack of pigmentation in my skin. These aren't gray hairs yet, most of them, but they're growing in places where my skin doesn't have any pigment. This is the definition of leprosy in the Old Testament law. I, with this face, would not be allowed into temple worship. And lepers were excluded from the worship of the community. They were experiencing a kind of spiritual exclusion. They were not able to worship God the way that God had created human beings to worship him. And so there's this entire class of people who are spiritually outcast. So when Jesus takes care of the leprosy, what he's doing is not just fixing their skin. He's putting them back into a regular life of worship. He's saving them from a worship problem, a spiritual problem, an exclusion problem. The widow of Nain, I think it's Luke 7, is it the widow of Nain? Her son's dead. And that's really sad. But in the ancient Near East, if you're a woman who doesn't have a husband because you're widowed, your livelihood, your support, is meant to come from a son, because he can do what it is that needs to be done in order to make money, right? He can work in the fields. You can't. You're an elderly woman. You're not physically able to do what in that culture is going to be required to produce food and to make a living. So when her son dies, the widow is not just sad because she's lost a son. She's also sad because she's going to starve to death. She's not going to make it very long, unless or she's going to become a beggar. She's right at the brink of being of experiencing terrible physical deprivation, to the point that she could potentially die because she might lack shelter and food. So when Jesus raises her son from the dead and it literally says, and he gives him back to his mother, right? Like Luke's like zooming in on this moment where Jesus is taking somebody and he's saying, what's important here? That this woman gets her son back because he's going to provide for her again. She's being saved from physical deprivation. She is being restored the way to meet her physical needs. And so Jesus saves in that way too. Jesus isn't just in the business of saving from social isolation or from spiritual exclusion, but also from physical lack. And so the church is a place in Acts. I mean, it starts out as a place where all goods are held in common, where it doesn't matter if you're a widow. You can still come to this place and come to this community, and you will be cared for. Your physical needs will be met. You will be saved in that way, rescued. In our culture, we struggled mightily with hopelessness and despair. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, why do you think I keep talking about this resurrection? It's because you have a living hope, right? If Jesus was not raised from the dead, then all of this is in vain. You know, I'm the greatest of fools, or whatever Paul says. I mean, 1 Corinthians 15 is 100% about the fact that your life has meaning because Jesus came back. Your life has a future and a purpose because of resurrection. You have been saved from hopelessness and despair. These really critical things that are taking lives from us left and right, especially young people. Suicide rates are horrible. And because people are caught in the middle of a life where there's no hope. And Paul says, no, the Jesus event, the Christ event has saved us from hopelessness. All throughout the New Testament, Jesus' ministry is he goes and he sees people who are spiritually oppressed. They're in bondage to some kind of sin. They're in bondage to some kind of power that causes them to do things they don't want to do. And Jesus wipes that away. He breaks that power. He shatters those chains. So you're not condemned to live this way anymore. You have new hope. That spiritual bondage you carry with you, it's freed up. You are now let go in his name. You're liberated, rescued, saved from those things that drag you down. Notice that every single one of those examples is indeed a way that Jesus saves. And it's also not being saved from sin. The point is that salvation has lots of dimensions to it. And not every single one of those dimensions, maybe not even most of those dimensions, has to do with fixing your sin problem. Some of those dimensions do. And that's not to be ignored. And we spent some time saying, let's not lose a really thick, robust notion of the power of sin, its corruption, how dangerous but let's also not focus so totally on sin that we lose a sense of what salvation is for. Salvation is not just to deal with the sin problem, it's to deal with all of these problems, to move people from these places of deprivation, lack, isolation, bondage, to true, authentic, human, flourishing life, the life that Christ demonstrates. Salvation in Christ, we might say, is cosmic, meaning it's top to bottom. We didn't even mention the salvation of the created order, the created worlds. Paul fully expects that the Spirit is renewing creation, and that a new heavens and a new earth are coming. They're imminent. That too, even the ground itself, is liberated in the event of Jesus. It is full, top to bottom, all of reality. All of reality is liberated, rescued, and saved. That is mighty. It is a big, big, big salvation. And so human life and the created world, all of it is meant to be liberated in every possible way. The Christ event, the giving of the Spirit, the inauguration of the church, the new age to come, it is all about total and complete salvation, not just salvation from this or that. And depending on your tradition, you probably started to zero in on this or that. Some traditions in the church zero in on, we've got to fix all of the poverty problems that people have, and that's the salvation we're going to focus on. In other traditions of evangelicalism, it's all about the sin thing. We've got to get right with God, and that's the be-all, end-all. When we laser in on these things, we lose the breadth, the width, the height, the depth of the salvation of God that is available in Christ by the power of the Spirit. At the end of the day, whatever the problem is, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, social, cultural, whatever it is, whatever aspect of human or created life is in need of rescue, kind of the evangelical Christian conviction is that in some way that's what Jesus was about. That's, I had a friend once who said he sums up the gospel in, I don't always know what the problem is, but I know that the solution, or I don't always know what the question is, but I'm pretty sure the answer is Jesus. And that, it's bumper sticker sloganeering, I get that, but it's also there's something insightful, there's something profound about it, because it's asking us to widen our eyes as to what's up in the issue of salvation. What's going on at the cross? What's going on in Jesus' life? What's going on in his resurrection? What's going on in the coming of the Spirit? What's going on in the generation of the church? What's going on in the coming eschaton? It is a complete and total cosmic, top to bottom, all dimensions of human life, all dimensions of created life, all of it saved, rescued, delivered, sealed, signed, and delivered.